Hi everybody, I wanted to record a quick video for this week because we're getting into Aristotle, and this is some of the most foundational concept work for rhetorical theory that we've done so far, and it's going to be really important for the next few weeks, especially as we head into your midterm paper, and we're going to return to Aristotle after midterm week as well. So I wanted to provide, like I said, just a kind of a few heuristics for some of the concepts that we're working with this week, so that as you're reading some of the very extensive comments on these concepts in the Aristotle book, that you can sort of refer back to these and keep them in mind. So one of the things that Aristotle is doing in his book on rhetoric is really recuperating the idea of rhetoric. And by that I mean he's responding to both Plato and to the Sophists. He doesn't really like the Sophist emphasis on using flowery or flamboyant language. He thinks rhetoric is more than just the art of speaking well or putting together fancy-sounding speeches. And he also wants to respond to Plato, who criticized rhetoric as being like cookery rather than like medicine, or as being inherently sort of suspect for its potential to corrupt the citizens of Athens. So for Aristotle, rhetoric really does have a capacity for good. It can help us make decisions. It can help us discover things. It can help us come to agreements. And for him, it's really a counterpoint of dialectic. Dialectic, of course, is something that Plato, of course, holds in very high esteem as sort of a pinnacle of approaches to discovering sort of truth, or of coming to an understanding, or of analyzing complex ideas. And by saying that rhetoric is the counterpoint of dialectic, Aristotle is really elevating rhetoric to a techne, to an art and a discipline, rather than just a knack or a hobby like cookery. And more specifically, rhetoric is a techne of discovery, just like dialectic is a techne of discovery. They both start in what we call endoxa, or sort of shared or common values and knowledge, and they both deal with breaking down or coming to understand complex topics, but rhetoric just has slightly different ends and slightly different means than dialectic. So for rhetoric, as a techne of discovery, more to the point, we're discovering the available means of persuasion. So when he uses this as his definition of rhetoric, he's really fundamentally changing Plato's approach and the Sophists' approach to rhetoric. For them, rhetoric was the sort of art of being able to devise a speech based on anything, right, on any topic, and to persuade people and to impress them. For Aristotle, rhetoric is really a field of study. It's a field of inquiry, and it's the field of studying the available means of persuasion in a given context. So to start to devise rhetoric as a technique, you have to sort of set the parameters for, okay, what's within rhetoric? What is rhetoric's purview? What are the different kinds of ways that we can categorize rhetoric? So he gives us these three, your study questions for this week call it species of rhetoric, but I prefer the term occasions, the three occasions for rhetoric. And those are forensic, epideictic, and deliberative. And I'm going to give you sort of a useful, what I think, a framework or heuristic for thinking about how those different categories work. And it's really simple. We're just going to think about it in terms of past, present, and future. So in general, forensic rhetoric is the rhetoric of the past. It's concerned with questions about the past, namely questions like, what happened? Forensic rhetoric helps us to make sense of events that happened in the past, and it helps us to categorize them, to say, this is this type of event, this is this type of event. An example of this is in courtroom discourse. Courtroom discourse is all about saying what happened. Did a murder take place, or did an accidental death take place? Was this event a robbery, or was it a misunderstanding? Was the defendant in this location at this time, or was he not? So this is all about asking questions about what happened. A prosecutor has a very specific job. His job is to, or her job is to, argue that the defendant committed whatever crime they have been accused of, whereas a defending lawyer's job is to make a convincing argument that that didn't happen, that either the defendant was not in that place at that time at all, or that rather than committing a murder, an accident occurred. So courtroom discourse is a really good go-to example, and it's what Aristotle relies on as well. It's all about figuring out what happened and what we're going to name this event, how we're going to think of events of the past. Apodictic rhetoric, on the other hand, is really centered in the moment. We can think of it as rhetoric of the present. And the question that we might be able to associate with apodictic rhetoric is, what does this moment call for? Does it call for placing blame on an individual or a group? Or does it call for awarding praise? And that's really going to be based on the occasion. Apodictic rhetoric is often found in ceremonies like graduation, or funerals, or other kinds of ceremonial occasions, where we might be praising or blaming an individual or a group. And then deliberative rhetoric we can think of as rhetoric of the future. And really the kinds of questions that are being taken up in deliberative rhetoric is what should happen, not what did happen or what is happening right now, but what should happen in the future. What should we be doing? What should we be working toward? What should our next step be? So in this case, rhetoric really can help us make decisions and can help us work toward the happiness or the well-being of society or of certain constituents within a society. So the most common example of deliberative rhetoric, and this is the example that Aristotle relies on, is legislation. Lawmaking is all about making decisions about the future, about answering questions about what should happen. But things like proposals are also good examples of deliberative rhetoric. If we want to build a new park or hire a new employee, we might have to write a proposal for a new position to be created. We're making an argument about something that should happen in the future. And we're trying to get other people on our side. So in addition to the three major species of rhetoric, Aristotle talks about the appeals that are made within rhetorical discourse. And this is also part of the purview of rhetoric as a techne. So in answer to the question of what does rhetoric, the study of the available means of persuasion, concern itself with, Aristotle lays out these three sort of rhetorical appeals. And of course, for him, logos is sort of the uber appeal. Some of you made note of that in your discussion board posts last week, which is accurate. But in book 2 of his book on rhetoric, he spends a lot of time with ethos and pathos. And so we're going to talk about all three of them in the next couple of minutes. And again, I'm giving you some kind of quick and dirty heuristics or frameworks for thinking about this because it might be useful. It doesn't mean that they universally apply, but they can just be sort of helpful ways of thinking, ways of remembering these things. So I've given you here an example that I have found useful. It's the rhetorical triangle. I think this is useful for helping us locate some of the sources of these different appeals. So in any rhetorical context, in any of these occasions for a speech, occasions of rhetoric, we're going to have three main entities according to Aristotle. We're going to have a speaker, we're going to have a message, and we're going to have an audience. Those three things are all necessary for it to be rhetorical discourse. Someone just shouting into the void is not going to be rhetorical discourse. And so we have three appeals that kind of roughly correspond with these 3 points on the rhetorical triangle. We have appeals to ethos. That's the credibility of the speaker, not the credibility of the audience, not the credibility of the message, the credibility of the speaker. We have pathos, which is appeals to emotion, and that's the emotions of the audience. And I gave feedback to a couple of people in the discussion boards from last week because when you were analyzing that Martin Luther King speech, you made a comment like, this is a pathos appeal because Martin Luther King has felt pain. And it's not about the pain that the speaker is feeling or the emotion that the speaker is feeling. It's about the emotion that the speaker is trying to get members of the audience to feel. And then a logos, we're going to locate primarily in the message itself. And we're going to look for appeals to logic that are woven into the way that the message is structured and delivered. But as you can see on this triangle, all of these arrows go in both directions. So these are not hard and fast categories. They all impact each other. It's just kind of a useful way of thinking about where we're going to locate those appeals. So as I said, logos is kind of the uber appeal for Aristotle. And Herrick talks about logos as the proofs located in the words, structure, and arguments of discourse or of rhetoric. Okay, so that's a lot to take in. Some of you in your discussion of the logos appeals in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech talked about the use of facts or statistics or citing of sources. That's absolutely correct. And it's what I would call external strategies for logos. Drawing on outside facts and statistics and documents. But it's also drawing on patterns of reasoning, ways of making us follow along with a line of thinking so that we reach the conclusion that the speaker wants us to reach. Those patterns of reasoning could be things like cause and effect. Setting up a cause and effect structure will get us to believe that a certain outcome is going to be the result of an action that we might take. Drawing on precedent, right? Well, neighboring town had this problem that's similar to our problem. They approached it this way and it's worked out pretty well for them, so we should do the same thing. Or using analogy or comparison, or, in the case that I have here, a visual metaphor. If you remember this PSA from the 90s, this is your brain on drugs. The pattern of thought here is drugs fry your brain. Therefore, you should not do drugs because you don't want a fried brain. So that's the logic at play here, is you have the egg as a metaphor for your brain getting fried. Pathos, as I said, is going to be located in the audience. A successful rhetor is going to understand that emotions have causes and effects, and you can utilize both of those effectively in your speech. So once you understand what the intended effect that you want is, you could think about what emotion is going to you can cause to lead to that eventual effect. I want to stress that emotion and logic are not opposites. Herrick notes that emotions are part of our rational responses to certain circumstances. So we don't want to put these things in a binary or a hierarchy, right? That logic is always better than emotion. Emotions are part of how we respond to things. It's just how we are as humans. And then, of course, Aristotle treats emotions in these opposing pairs like anger or calmness, confidence or shame throughout Book 2. But when we're trying to locate pathos, we can sort of work backwards. And this goes to when we're planning a speech too, right? Start thinking about the purpose. What's the end goal? What's the result of the speech? Do you want people to riot in the streets? Do you want them to vote a certain way? Do you want them to go out and celebrate? Think about what that goal is and what the action of the audience is. Then you have to think about the emotion that's going to lead to that desired action. And once you've pinpointed that, okay, what's the most useful emotion here? Is it anger or is it hope? Then turn to your Aristotle and you look at the causes of that emotion. What causes people to be angry? What causes people to become hopeful? And then we can start putting those causes, those provocations in our speeches. We can start relying on strategies that are likely to cause those emotions. And then finally we have ethos. And as I said, those arrows on that triangle do go both ways. So, ethos is about the credibility of the speaker, but it's also about, more to the point, it's about how a speaker adapts their character or presents a version of their character that's going to be most likely to be well received by their audience, right? Ethos is not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's tempting to say, oh, this person has a doctoral degree. They're automatically credible, they're automatically trustworthy, they have ethos. But what makes you respectable to one group of people can completely fall flat with another. So it's important to think about how ethos is cultivated in the context of a specific speech. And I have my little Dark Knight illusion there, right? There's a time for Batman and there's a time for Bruce Wayne. There's a time to be a hero, there's a time to be the scapegoat. that plays into ethos as well.